Steam from the mesquite grill still clung to my jacket when my brother-in-law called me a walking checkbook in front of everyone at our family barbecue. I'm Clifton Ray 48, a corporate controller gripping my father's smooth pocket watch as the fluorescent patio lights buzzed overhead. Ever had a moment like that turn your whole life sideways? The mesquite smoke hung heavy in the October air, curling over the pecan trees and clinging to the back of my throat as I stood near the grill, beer sweating in my hand. Kids zigzagged across the lawn with scuffed footballs, their laughter punctuating the deep hum of conversation from the cluster of adults. Kent's voice, loud and booming, cut through it all like he owned the air we breathed. He stood by the picnic table, a rib bone wagging in his fingers, laughing in a way that carried just far enough for everyone to hear. Now a real man doesn't just count the money, he crowed, glancing sideways at me. A real man handles it, risks it, grows it, doesn't just sit behind a desk balancing someone else's books. His grin was all teeth, his eyes slick with the kind of confidence that only ever came when he had a crowd to impress. People chuckled politely, unsure if they were laughing at the joke or at me. Maribel stood behind him, her hands fluttering around her cup, smiling in that tight, fragile way of someone who didn't want to take sides. I could feel my jaw tightening the familiar weight of my father's pocket watch in my palm. The brass was warm from my skin, smooth from decades of wear, ticking soft and steady, like it was reminding me to keep my composure. I stared past Kent, past the smirks and polite coughs, to the pecan leaves drifting lazily to the ground. A calm veneer, that's all I had left in that moment. The scent of the grill shifted when Kent tossed something my way. A folded BBQ receipt, still smudged with grease, arced through the air and landed by my feet.
"Guess this is your specialty, Cliff,"
he said, raising his beer in mock salute.
"Counting, not cooking. Some of us bring the fire, some just write checks."
He smiled like a man testing his own echo, waiting for the laughter to rise. And it did low and nervous, but it came. I bent down and picked up the receipt, careful not to meet anyone's eyes. Rib grease smeared my fingers, the paper limp between them. I folded it once, then again, and slipped it into my pocket beside the watch, where I could feel the sharp edge of paper against the smooth metal. The watch ticked louder in my ear, or maybe it was my own pulse. Kent wasn't finished. Cliff here, he's the guy who can pay a $12,000 bill without blinking, but can't even manage a grill. What's the point of a man who can't bring heat, huh? The chuckles came louder this time, bolder, like the permission had been granted. I heard one of the uncles mutter something about me being too soft for Texas, and the back of my neck prickled. I didn't say a word. Words were fuel, and Kent already had his match lit. I caught Ivy Callahan's gaze from across the yard. Her brow arched ever so slightly as she sipped her iced tea. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The look said enough she'd heard every word, filed it away, somewhere. PTA chairs had long memories, especially for moments like this. I let Kent's laughter fade into the background, the sound becoming a distant rattle, like the clinking of empty bottles. My hand tightened around the pocket watch, its ticking a private metronome, counting out the seconds until I could step away without a scene. I thought of my father carrying this same watch through tougher rooms than this, rooms where a man's pride could be stripped to the bone if he wasn't careful. When the first lull in conversation came, I slipped my beer onto the side table, nodded to no one in particular, and murmured something about an early morning meeting. Nobody stopped me. Kent was too busy holding court rib bone raised like a scepter. Driving home, the night air cooler through the open window, I laid the pocket watch on the dashboard. Its steady tick-tick seemed louder against the hum of the road, louder even than Kent's laughter echoing in the back of my mind. The lights along the interstate blurred as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Each tick felt like a countdown, though I wasn't sure yet to what. Only that something had started quietly beneath the smoke, and the laughter, and time was already keeping score. I didn't call Maribel. I didn't text Kent. I didn't send a polite email to smooth things over like I'd done in the past after his outbursts. The morning after that barbecue, I just stopped. Stopped checking in, stopped transferring money for emergencies, stopped pretending the laughter and grease-stained receipts hadn't stung. The absence was deliberate as the soft hum of the heater in Grace Fellowship's lounge a few weeks later, where I sat with Pastor Silas over 2 mugs of black coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since dawn. The pine garlands along the windows gave off a faint, resinous scent, a reminder of the season. Outside, the Dallas wind rattled the bare branches. Silas cupped his mug in both hands, the steam fogging the lenses of his glasses for a second before he spoke. "Sometimes silence," he said, his voice as unhurried as always, "is the lesson money can't buy. People can ignore words. They can't ignore a missing handout." His gaze lingered on me, calm but searching. I nodded, fingers wrapped around my own mug, letting the bitter warmth anchor me while the low notes of the choir's practice carried faintly down the hallway. I didn't answer him right away. The coffee was bitter enough to pull me back into the present, the scent of pine mingling with the faint echo of carols through the church hall. When I did speak, my voice came out softer than I'd planned.
"I think they'll notice soon enough. Maybe not the way I did, but they will."
Silas nodded once as if we'd settled something important without needing a full discussion. He didn't press for details. He never did. That was his strength. He let the silence do most of the talking. By late afternoon, I was back in my office downtown, the faint hum of the heater replaced by the creak of my chair as I leaned over my desk. Outside, the city skyline glowed under a winter haze, but inside, the only light came from the harsh glow of my dual monitors. Spreadsheets stretched across them, rows of black and green cells scrolling under my fingertips. My fingers, stiff from the chill of the office air, paused when I opened an internal memo flagged in red Sloan Industrial overdue on safety audit invoice status unresolved. The date stamp was 3 weeks old, the note beneath it curt and damning, follow-up pending escalation advised. I stared at the line for a long moment, listening to the faint tick of my father's pocket watch in my vest pocket, a sound just loud enough to fill the room when I muted the computer's alert chimes. I didn't forward the memo, didn't make a call. Instead, I slid my mouse over to the Save As option, renaming the file, and tucked it into a private folder on my desktop, where I kept notes that weren't for anyone else's eyes yet. My hand brushed the smooth case of the watch. As I closed the folder, the metal cool, but solid. Waiting had become my weapon of choice. The knock on my office door was a soft double tap. Duke Hensley poked his head in, his tie loosened and eyebrow raised, as if he could smell the tension in the air.
"You see the Sloan reports?"
he asked. Voice pitched low. I swiveled in my chair just enough to face him, nodding toward the second monitor, where the red flags were still visible. He stepped inside, leaning on the edge of my desk, eyes narrowing. "Word is, he's been cutting corners again. Materials inspections, you name it." Might bite him sooner than later. The way he said it, casual but heavy, told me it wasn't just gossip. Duke didn't waste words on rumors. I didn't answer, just clicked the monitor off with a soft snick and leaned back, letting the chair's springs groan beneath my weight. Duke straightened, giving me a long look, before tapping the desktop with 2 fingers, and heading for the door.
"Patience, Cliff,"
He said, without turning back.
"The rope tightens on its own."
When the office finally emptied out, I printed the flagged email, the paper warm and slightly curled from the machine. I slid it into my leather folio alongside a fresh legal pad. My fingers lingered on the pocket watch nestled in the folio's side pouch, its steady rhythm almost syncing with the faint whoosh of the heater kicking on. The building was quiet, just the occasional creak of ducks and the distant hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum. I whispered into the stillness, not for anyone to hear, not even for Silas, just for myself. Patience, Cliff. Patience. The watch ticked on as if agreeing each beat a reminder that not every answer had to be forced. Some only needed time. The church hall smelled of oak polish and over-poured Chardonnay, that faintly sour tang that clung to the air long after the first glass was emptied. It was a PTA mixer, though. Anyone walking in off the street might have mistaken it for a country club cocktail hour, laughter riding over faint country music, murmurs about fundraisers and board seats, and the occasional clink of glasses echoing off the hardwood floors. I stood near the back of the room, my fingers curled loosely around my father's watch in my vest pocket, tracing the familiar grooves along its rim. That soft ticking had become my steady backdrop in rooms like this, something to focus on when the noise became too much. Kent's voice predictably rose above the chatter like a badly tuned horn. A little drunk, his face flushed and his collar unbuttoned, he had found an audience near the refreshments table. Maribel lingered beside him, her smile flickering on and off like a light bulb with a loose wire. When he caught sight of me, his grin widened in a way that told me whatever came next wouldn't be accidental.
"Careful, Cliff,"
he said, sidling closer, his hand outstretched.
"Wouldn't want to drop your little trinket there. Doesn't look like it could handle much."
Before I could answer, his fingers plucked the watch from my pocket, quick and casual, and he began twirling it by its chain like a prop on stage. The chain flashed under the recessed lights as he spun it. He kept talking loud, jovial about risk and reward, and how some folks just don't understand what it takes to make money move. I caught Maribel's eyes darting between us, the unease in her brow deepening as Kent's thumb slipped on the polished brass. The watch tumbled from his grip, clattering against the hardwood with a sound that cut through the music and murmurs like a glass breaking. I bent down slow and deliberate to pick it up. The lid had a new jagged crack running diagonally across its face, catching the light like a fresh scar. I didn't say a word. I snapped the lid shut with a soft click, the sound sharp enough to make Kent's grin falter for half a second. I slid the watch back into my pocket, feeling the rough line of the damage beneath my thumb. My silence felt heavier than anything I could have said, so I let it sit there, a weight between us, while Maribel tugged gently at Kent's sleeve to steer him back toward safer topics. The room's chatter resumed its natural flow, but a few faces had turned toward us long enough to catch the moment. Duke Hensley appeared at my shoulder, his presence as steadying as it had been in my office months before. His voice was pitched low, meant only for me. "Funny how things break before they get fixed, huh?" he said, slipping a folded sheet of paper into my hand. I kept my eyes on the oak-paneled walls as I unfolded it slightly, scanning the list of contracts Sloan Industrial was hanging onto by a thread. Deadlines, missed payments, late whispers about inspections being bypassed. I refolded it, slid it into the same pocket as the watch, and nodded once. Duke didn't need a response. He just clapped me on the shoulder and drifted back into the crowd. Across the room, Kent had resumed his bravado, laughing too loudly and gesturing with his drink as he bragged about cutting fat from contracts to keep margins high. He didn't notice Ivy Callahan, standing a few feet away, her hand resting on her glass stem, one eyebrow raised in quiet appraisal. Ivy wasn't the type to interrupt, but she didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of ledger, one Kent couldn't read yet. I leaned back against the wall near the exit, the chatter of the mixer blending into a low hum. My thumb traced the cracked line on the watch's lid again, slow and measured, as my phone buzzed in my pocket. Ivy's name lit up the screen with a short message. "People are noticing. Keep still. Let the rope tighten." I slid the phone away, letting the words settle like the echo of that crack on the hardwood floor. Around me, the music played on a fiddle, bending out a slow tune, and Kent's laugh rose once more over the crowd. I didn't move, didn't speak. The watch ticked in my pocket, each beat syncing with my breath, as if even time itself was reminding me patience would do the work for me. The morning sunlight filtered through the magnolia trees, painting shifting patterns across the courtyard tiles of Grace Fellowship. The scent of fresh-cut grass drifted in on the breeze, mixing with the sharp aroma of coffee brewing in the foyer. I sat on a wrought iron bench near the fountain, black coffee warming my hands, a small leather ledger open across my knee. Children darted across the lawn, their laughter carrying in the stillness, punctuated only by the soft creak of the magnolia branches overhead. Word spread fast in places like this, faster than the Sunday bulletin. The church's spring gala invitation list had gone out that morning, and for the first time in a decade, Maribel and Kent Sloane's names weren't on it. The realization hit them here in the courtyard, while the magnolia blossoms drifted down like pale confetti on an audience that wasn't sure whether to pity them or look away. Kent's voice cut through the calm, like the rip of a saw.
"You're telling me we didn't make the list?"
He barked his words, aimed at Deacon Wilkes, a soft-spoken man who looked as though he'd rather face a tax audit than Kent Sloane. After 10 years of donations of hosting tables of support, his hands waved wide the coffee cup he'd been holding, tilting just enough to splatter a brown arc across the flagstones. Maribel tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically, her eyes darting to the growing circle of glances around them. Her voice barely carried over the gentle trickle of the fountain, but Kent's carried just fine.
"This is a joke, right? Somebody's idea of punishment for what? For doing business the way everyone does." His tone, that usual mix of bravado and contempt, cracked around the edges, drawing the first few murmurs from the nearby benches. Duke Hensley strolled past me on his way to the office wing, his head cocked just slightly toward the scene unfolding. Without stopping, he muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Funny how quickly doors close when character comes into question." His footsteps faded, leaving his words to linger like the magnolia scent. Ivy Callahan approached from the opposite side. Her steps measured her expression as composed as always. She didn't bother to look toward Kent, who was now jabbing a finger in the air for emphasis. Instead, she extended a manila folder to me, her voice low. "Pension board agenda," she said. "Sloane Industrial's case is on the docket." Her eyes flicked once toward the fountain, then back to me, her meaning clear without another word. I set my coffee down on the bench beside me and flipped open the ledger to jot a note. Dates, times, a reminder to cross-check the flagged invoices Duke had given me. The pen moved slowly across the page, each stroke deliberate. The tension in the air hummed louder than the faint choir rehearsal echoing from inside the sanctuary. The crack in my father's watch pressed against my thigh through the fabric of my vest pocket. I slipped it out and turned it in my palm, tracing that diagonal scar with my thumb as the sounds around me blurred the laughter of children,
the low voices of the onlookers, Kent's rising pitch as he argued with the deacon. The watch ticked softly, a reminder that silence often spoke louder than speeches, louder than Kent's flailing indignation. Then came the sharp bang of a wooden chair slamming against the courtyard tiles. Kent, flushed and shaking, had thrown it down hard enough to startle the nearest children into silence. Heads turned. Murmurs grew louder. The chair sat awkwardly on its side, a mute testament to a man unraveling in public. Maribel stooped to right it, her movements quick and brittle, her face tight with embarrassment. I closed my ledger, placed the watch gently back into my pocket, and slipped the manila folder Ivy had handed me into my folio. The weight of paper and brass together felt heavier than either alone, like two instruments measuring the same countdown. I took a slow sip of cooling coffee eyes, fixed on the magnolia blossoms, drifting lazily down, before rising from the bench. The pension board meeting was in 2 weeks. I brushed a stray blossom from my sleeve, feeling the faint pulse of the watch's ticking against my chest as I murmured low enough for only myself to hear, "Time is almost up." Then I walked toward the office wing, leaving Kent's raised voice and the chair's lingering echo behind, knowing the sound of that slam would do more damage to his standing than any argument ever could. The air in the Lone Star Manufacturing conference room felt as stale as the coffee cooling in its styrofoam cups. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, casting a pale, flattened glow over the long table and the rows of neatly stacked binders. The AC pushed out a steady, chilly stream, but Kent was still sweating a faint sheen on his forehead that he kept dabbing at with a crumpled napkin. His voice. When he greeted the board members, pitched higher than usual, each syllable carrying a forced brightness that didn't match his darting eyes. I sat at the far end of the table, a spreadsheet open in front of me, edges curled from overhandling my pen, marking off columns one by one. The quiet ticking of my father's watch in my vest pocket was the only sound that felt steady in the room. The board chair cleared her throat, glancing between us and the stack of documents waiting to be addressed. It was supposed to be a routine quarterly review, but even before Duke entered, I could feel the tension pressing down on Kent like the weight of the AC's recycled air. Duke Hensley walked in with his usual calm, a slim folder tucked under his arm. He didn't bother to sit. Instead, he laid the flagged safety reports and unpaid invoices in front of me, his fingers tapping lightly on the manila cover before stepping back. I slid the folder across to the board chair, without a word, the papers whispering against the polished surface. The top document bore Sloan Industrial's letterhead, but it was the rows of red flags that drew the board members' eyes, missed inspections overdue, audits invoices marked unresolved in bold type. Kent's smile faltered as the pages turned. "This is a witch hunt!" He blurted, the forced joviality gone in an instant. His hand, reaching for his coffee, trembled just enough to send the styrofoam cup tipping over a dark stain, spreading across the table, bleeding into the edge of a contract draft. He scrambled, with napkins, muttering, "Cliff's been gunning for me for months, digging through paperwork to make me look bad. This isn't oversight, it's sabotage." No one replied right away. The only sound was the crackle of the styrofoam cup as Kent crumpled it in his fist, the room waiting for the board chair to speak. When she did, her tone was cool, practiced. "Mr. Sloan, we're not here to discuss interpersonal grievances. These reports speak for themselves." She flipped a page, her brow tightening. "Multiple safety violations delayed vendor payments and discrepancies in your reporting. Until these matters are resolved, Your contracts with Lone Star will be suspended pending full review. Serious ethical concerns remain."
Kent's face flushed a deep mottled red. His jaw worked silently for a beat before the words spilled out sharp and desperate. "This is ridiculous, Cliffs. Just a coward hiding behind spreadsheets feeding you numbers to take me down because he doesn't have the guts to face me like a man." He slammed his palm against the table, rattling the empty cup and drawing a few startled glances from the junior auditors by the door. The board chair didn't flinch. She closed the folder with a measured motion, resting her hands on top of it. And yet, she said evenly, her voice cutting through the hum of the AC, "Those spreadsheets may save lives. Facts don't need bravado to stand." The silence that followed was heavier than Kent's outburst, the kind of quiet that leaves no room for rebuttal. Kent sagged back into his chair, his chest heaving, eyes darting from one unsympathetic face to another. The cup lay crushed beside him, a brown ring staining the top sheet of one of his own reports. Duke gave me the faintest nod from across the room, his expression unreadable but steady before turning to leave. When the meeting adjourned, I rose without a word, sliding my notes into my folio. My fingers found the cracked lid of my father's watch as I stepped into the hallway, the faint tick, almost loud, against the muted sounds of the office floor. I paused by the window overlooking the city, Dallas shimmering under the summer sun, and let out a slow breath. "Time's never been louder," I murmured, feeling the rough groove of the crack beneath my thumb as I slipped the watch back into my pocket and walked away, leaving Kent's unraveling behind me. The Sunday morning light streamed through Grace Fellowship's stained glass windows, splintering into ribbons of amber and deep sapphire that danced across the fellowship hall's polished floor. The colors caught the crack in my father's pocket watch, where it rested in my hand, the jagged line refracting the glow like a scar that had somehow become a jewel. The choir's voices warmed up softly in the sanctuary, beyond the faint hum of their harmony, weaving with the scent of brewed coffee and the sweetness of coffee cake laid out on the tables. It was the kind of morning that felt calm on the surface, even as the weight of everything pressing down lingered just beneath. Duke stood near the hallway door, his voice pitched low as I straightened the stack of papers on the table in front of me. "When you build something bigger than yourself," he murmured, watching my pen trace the signature lines, "even broken things find purpose." He didn't have to nod toward the watch or the documents. The meaning was clear enough. These weren't just numbers or contracts or acts of retaliation. They were about building something that outlasted the sting of bruised pride and unpaid invoices. The pen scratched lightly across the parchment, the last loop of my signature, sealing the creation of the Legacy Fund, a pool of support for the workers Kent's suspended contracts had left stranded. Their livelihoods had been the quiet collateral damage in all of this, and for the first time since the Sloan unraveling began, I felt like something permanent, something worthwhile was being built in the ashes. I set the pen down beside the papers, my hand brushing the cool brass of the watch in my vest pocket. Its steady ticking was almost comforting in the quiet between choir verses. That quiet didn't last. Kent and Maribel moved hesitantly into the hall, their voices subdued, their shoulders rounded in a way I'd never seen before. Kent's usual brashness was gone. He looked like a man whose reflection had finally caught up with him. Maribel clutched a folded sheet of paper, probably another letter to the board, and her voice trembled as she said my name. "Cliff, please, can you talk to them?" "The board. Tell them we can make things right, if they'd just—" Before I could answer, Pastor Silas stepped from the corner, his posture steady, his expression calm but immovable.
He rested a hand lightly on Maribel's shoulder, his deep voice even.
This isn't about shortcuts or who you know. What's done is done. What matters now is who you choose to be moving forward.
His words didn't cut. They settled like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward with quiet weight. Kent's jaw tightened, then slackened his gaze, drifting down toward the floor as Silas held his silence. I kept my hand on the watch thumb, grazing the crack across its lid. I could feel every heartbeat ticking against the brass, a metronome for my decision not to speak, not to gloat, not to reproach, not to offer false comfort. The documents I'd signed were the only response I needed to give. The workers would have their support. Kent and Maribel would have the space to reckon with their own wreckage. The choir's hymn swelled in the background, voices rising in harmony that seemed to fill every inch of the hall. Kent's head bowed not in prayer, but with the dawning weight of what his choices had wrought. Maribel's fingers tightened around the folded paper before she let it drop to her side, her eyes shining with something between shame and relief. Silas murmured something low to them both, his words too soft to catch, but they lingered by his side rather than turning back toward me. I gathered my folio and slid the signed papers inside the cracked watch, settling into the same pocket with a faint metallic tap. The hall felt warm with voices and sunlight, but the cool air outside called like a pause button. I needed to press. Stepping through the double doors, the crisp bite of early autumn brushed against my face, a sharp contrast to the lingering sweetness of coffee cake on my fingers. The watch ticked steadily in my pocket as I drew a deep breath of the cool air, each beat a reminder of how far this had come and how much still hung in the balance. Not every wound heals yet, I whispered to myself, watching the stained glass reflections fade as the door swung shut behind me. But maybe soon. The leaves rustled softly in reply, and for the first time in months, the ticking felt less like a countdown and more like a rhythm I could finally walk to. By the time winter settled over, Dallas Kent Sloan had traded his polished Italian loafers for scuffed steel-toed boots, the kind that left salt lines from parking lot slush along their edges. Maribel, once the unflappable hostess at every fundraiser, now stood behind a folding table, ladling steaming chili into styrofoam bowls, her smile smaller but steadier as she handed meals to anyone who stepped forward. The faint twang of a country guitar spilled from a portable speaker by the gazebo, blending with the distant laughter of kids skating along the park's frozen edges. I stood off to the side, hands buried deep in my coat pockets, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup that had already lost most of its heat. Pastor Silas's words from lunch earlier that week floated back as I watched the Legacy Fund outreach take shape around me. Grace doesn't mean rescue, he'd said, over a plate of cornbread at the diner. It means giving space for people to grow. His tone had been gentle, but the point sharp enough to cut through the comfort of warm food and casual conversation. Looking across the park now, I saw what he meant. The Sloans were working, not posturing, not pleading, just working. Carrying tables, wiping down benches, doling out food with quiet focus. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. Kent spotted me by the fence and crossed the distance slowly, his gait heavier, not from pride, but from the simple weariness of long days and early mornings. He stopped a few feet away, his breath visible in the cold air, and rubbed a hand over the stubble on his jaw. Cliff, he began, voice lower than I'd ever heard it. I just wanted to say thanks for not dragging us through the mud more than you already had to." He glanced down at the snow-muddied boots, then back up his eyes, steadier than his hands. "You letting go, that's the only thing that made me stop spiraling." I didn't answer right away. The steam from the chili pots curled in the wind between us, briefly hiding Maribel as she handed another bowl to a man in a threadbare coat. I shifted my weight, let the cold sting my ears a moment longer before nodding once. "You're here." I said the words simple, but deliberate. That's what matters now. Maribel passed by us moments later, her ladle dripping onto the snow-crusted path. She paused, her eyes meeting mine briefly before dropping toward the ground. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice catching like the wind tugging at the event tent. "For the things he said, for letting it happen." Her hand tightened on the ladle handle until her knuckles paled. Then she moved on the smell of chili and the faint tremor in her voice lingering longer than her shadow. I turned back to the task at hand, flipping open my event ledger and reviewing the schedule for the rest of the afternoon. Names, time slots, budget notes, mundane details that grounded me more than any apology or admission could. The guitar music shifted to a softer tune, a ballad that hung low in the air, while the snowflakes started to fall in earnest, dotting my coat sleeve and melting into cold patches against the fabric. Kent lingered by the food station, his posture less rigid now, more like a man learning the shape of humility. Silas stood a few feet away with Duke, their conversation easy, the occasional glance my way, carrying nothing more than quiet reassurance. No urging, no pushing, just the acknowledgement that this too was part of the process. As the last bowls were served and the tables began to empty, I closed my ledger, the snap of its worn cover sounding louder against the muffled quiet of falling snow. My father's watch rested in my pocket, still cracked, but warmer than the air around it. My thumb found its familiar groove as I looked out at the park, the frost-covered trees, the Sloanes moving slowly among the volunteers. Almost time, I whispered the words fogging into the cold air as the watch ticked softly beneath my hand. Snowflakes settled on my sleeve, melting into cool rivulets, but for the first time all season, the cold didn't bite quite as hard. 3 years after that humiliating BBQ, I stood at the Legacy Fund Gala, my father's watch now repaired, ticking steadily in my pocket, as if I'd found peace too. The Dallas ballroom glowed with warm light, the scent of pecans and cider mingling with soft jazz. Kent and Maribel moved humbly among the guests, far from their old pride. I spoke about resilience and quiet strength, the applause blending with the steady rhythm of the watch. Pastor Silas murmured, "Mended things, remind us, time heals what pride once broke." Stepping off the stage, I handed my notes to Ivy and said, "Time to build the next chapter." The watch's tick now a calm beat to carry me forward. The gala lights had dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of candles and the faint hum of the jazz trio as I stepped outside. The cool night air carried the scent of roasted pecans, and in my vest pocket, my father's watch ticked smoothly, at last, steady and whole like the man carrying it. Life had taught me that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums, giving us space to grow, to mend what pride once broke. Bridges fall, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding, and I've seen even the deepest rifts close with time and grace. What about you? Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story with us below.